right, well, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Jessica Kahn. I am the outgoing PI of the KL2 program, and in a moment, I'm going to introduce you to our new PI. I'm here with Krista Metz, who's the program manager. Jason Blackard, who's our co-director, could not make it today, and we're here with our excellent speakers who Dr. Zeller, our new director, is going to introduce in just a moment. But just a quick introduction to K-Club. K-Club is a research seminar that we hold every month. It's geared towards junior investigators, those who are writing a K award, who have a K award, or who are transitioning from a K award to an independent award. And we cover a variety of topics during the year. If you have suggestions for topics, we always would really appreciate your suggestions. So send those to Krista Metz. And I just wanted to let you know that after the seminar, you will receive by email a red cap survey evaluating the seminar. And we would really appreciate if you would complete that. It gives us great information that we can feed back to the speakers, but also information to help us improve our future seminars. Again, I wanted to introduce Dr. Meg Zeller, and then she'll introduce our speakers today and their topic. Dr. Zeller started this week as a PI of the KL2 program, and we're just absolutely thrilled to welcome her, and I'll be transitioning to a multiple PI position on the CCTST, the overall grant. So I will turn it over to Dr. Zeller.
Let's see. So we have a really interesting presentation today on the ins and outs of innovation, and it was very interesting for me to learn how our two institutions, UC and Cincinnati Children's, each have their own innovation offices, and which really tells me that there's a lot going on at this institution and a lot we can learn today from our speakers. So we have David Fullmer, who is from Sponsored Research Services and Contracts here at Cincinnati Children's, which is where I sit. We also have Justin Levy, who is from Cincinnati Children's Innovation Ventures, and then from the UC side, Jeff Pinski, who's Assistant Vice President, as you see here. And they can each introduce their roles and what those roles are and how they are clearly different, but very excited to learn with you all today. So passing the mic to whoever's speaking first.
Dave, you want to give a quick intro, and then I'll jump in and pass it on to Geoffrey.
Perfect.
Yeah, absolutely. My name's David Fullmer. I'm the contracts manager at Cincinnati Children's. My primary role is to kind of monitor, negotiate, and draft up research-related contracts. And those contracts can be anything from the material transfer agreements that we're going to talk about today to data transfer agreements or confidentiality agreements, clinical trial agreements. The entire gamut of research-related contracts run through my office, and my staff will deal with those.
My name is Justin Levy. I am the Director of Portfolio Management at Cincinnati Children's, as sort of Meg indicated. So Innovation Ventures is responsible for the innovation that gets developed at Cincinnati Children's with the goal of transitioning it out to partners for scalable use. And so we, we manage new ideas that come into our office and work in partnership with innovators to see that they can get out and get maximum uptake and use in the market.
And I'm Geoffrey Pinski. I'm the Assistant Vice President for Technology Transfer here at UC in the Office of Innovation. In much the same vein as Justin and his team at Innovation Ventures, our role is to help researchers find impact through commercialization of their research and or research output. I oversee the team here, which includes responsibilities right now for MTAs and CDAs. So I'm gonna sort of start. So we're gonna talk a little as to why MTAs help protect you and what do you need to watch out for. When to disclose new inventions, and you'll often hear us talk about inventions per se. That's because the majority of our portfolio is inventions on both sides, but that term is much broader and should be considered much broader. You know, whether in some of the questions ahead of time include things like intervention, behavioral interventions, They could include survey documents. They could include assessment tools. They also can include educational and related materials. And then what opportunities are here at our institutions to help ready our inventions for industry interest? The first question, though, and you heard it from Dr. Zeller ahead of time, is we're different, right? There's UC and there's Children's, although I think most researchers at Cincinnati Children's have academic appointments at UC. Their responsibilities are deviated, distributed between the two offices. The first and the easiest question to ask is who issues your paycheck? If you are being issued a UC paycheck, then you come over and you talk to my team. If you're being issued a Cincinnati Children's paycheck, you talk to Justin and Dave and their teams. And before I continue, if there's any questions, please feel free to use the chat. Obviously, we've left time at the end for question and answers as well. But don't hesitate if you have a question about a slide or any information. Feel free to click on that. So what do we do and why? You heard both Justin and I talk about commercialization and getting the technologies out of our respective institutions. Cincinnati Children's, I'm supposed to turn this over to Justin. Justin, do you want to talk about how this works at Children's?
Geoffrey, no, I totally appreciate it. And I think to Geoffrey's point, right, although like we have these separate offices, right, we really do work together a lot. I mean, Geoffrey and I are talking all the time. And so this is very collaborative. So I'm going to, play a quick video that's going to talk through about what we do, but ultimately, this will apply similarly to UC as well. So I'm going to pull this up real quick and press play, and someone holler at me if they cannot hear the sound.
New innovations help patients get better. Innovations begin as ideas, which come from Cincinnati Children's inventors like you. In a perfect world, all you need to be a successful inventor is to have a great idea. However, product development and securing investment are necessary before an innovation can reach the patient. These big challenges take years to accomplish. Setbacks and failures are common, even with the best ideas. No one can do this difficult work alone. You can improve your chances by teaming up with us, Cincinnati Children's Innovation Ventures. We use intellectual property tools to protect the financial rewards that investors want. We also verify the commercial potential with external audiences to help you plan your next move. Finding collaborators and other resources lets you begin product development. Your technology may need to undergo optimization, independent validation, feasibility and usability testing, and real-world validation and monitoring. Collaborators and service providers may help you, but you are the primary force behind the technology becoming a more appealing opportunity to investors, who may give it that shot at reaching patients. While you develop the product, we strategize with you. Our role is to help you choose the next move that advances your technology and to help you find resources and investors to keep you in the game. Your chances improve if investors show interest, but generating interest takes time. If opportunity strikes, we will negotiate licenses based on the strongest potential for clinical impact and returns, transferring the technology to an existing company or forming a startup. Not every innovation will become a product, but it's worthwhile to team up with us at Cincinnati Children's Innovation Ventures to try in order to save lives, to improve care, and to bring families the joy of getting better. We are changing the outcome together.
So I think that sort of walked through sort of the overall process, and I think there'll be similar themes on the UC side, but that kind of paints the overall picture. And I think the key points here are that researcher institutional experiences lead to these new ideas, right? And one of the reasons that it makes sense to work with us is because not in every case does publication actually result in wide adoption of those innovations? And so the roles of our office is to figure out how can we work with industry partners, companies, other organizations to make those products available to the market. And as Geoffrey alluded to earlier, right, like sometimes that isn't necessarily a for-profit company, right? In some cases where we're talking about behavioral tools or educational tools, it could be a nonprofit foundation. It could be a game manufacturer. There are a lot of ways to get these ideas out there, but ultimately, you can work with us to figure out who is the right partner, identify those partners, and figure out what are the steps that are needed to actually get it to scale and as much impact as possible. Really quickly, just to give you a sense of Cincinnati Children's Office, and then I'll pass it back to Geoffrey over at UC. This is sort of all of the historical numbers that you can kind of go through. Bottom line is, right, we see a lot of inventions, right? We have a strong track record of protecting IP through patents. We've been successful in licensing our technologies out there and have resulted in several startups. I think it's worth noting that our office is divided up into asset classes. And so no matter what you're working on, you're probably going to have someone within our office that can help you. So at Cincinnati Children's, our 4 asset classes are small molecule therapeutics first, second, biologic cell and gene therapies, third are medical devices and diagnostics, and fourth is digital health and care delivery. Again, no particular order there, but this just gives you a sense of sort of who our office is and the successes that we've had. And we'll talk a little bit more on a case study basis. I'll pass it back to Geoffrey here for UC.
Thanks, Justin. So one of the more recent changes, so UC formed the Office of Innovation in 2017. Technology transfer has been a function at the university for basically 40 years. We were originally formed in 1983, as I think when the first, but over time, those function and roles have changed, and more recently in 2017, the university formed the Office of Innovation. Since then, we've brought in 657 disclosures, 752 patent applications, 134 patents have been issued. We've got 94 licenses and options. But the Office of Innovation has a much broader function than just tech transfer. Tech transfer is just one piece. So the other things that the institution and our office has done is brought in 15 corporate partners that currently sit at 1819 at the corner of Reading and Lincoln near the old Ford factory, which is now part of Cincinnati Children's, and our venture lab, which partners with both UC and Children's and a number of others, has helped over 60 startups in this short time frame, and that number continues to grow. So we're here. The biggest piece to talk about really is commercialization and what that process looks like. It starts with you. It starts with research. From there, it goes through this process of disclosure, of telling us about it, us taking a look at it, protecting and marketing it, licensing, hopefully licensing and potentially starting a company. Maybe there's a product and there's a word. We're going to talk about this sort of circle as if every step happens. Sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes the assessment goes and it's negative. Sometimes we protect it and never find a licensee because it's either too far ahead of the market or the market completely changes after we file. But that first step in research is a place that both offices and many functions at both institutions support. And we support research in a variety of ways. But the biggest way, I think, and this is where Dave comes in on Cincinnati Children's side, and me and my team handle it here at UC, is MTAs. Dave, do you want to talk a little bit about MTAs and then MTAs at Children's?
Yeah, absolutely, Geoffrey. Thank you. So MTAs or material transfer agreements are a pretty common tool that we use in the world of research for simply sharing materials across institutions. And sometimes that's with research partners and collaborators, and sometimes that's with industry. Let me back up and just kind of explain what a material is as well. And those could be things like mouse lines or plasmids or vectors, things like human blood samples or human samples in general, or proteins. Those could be things that have been created here at Cincinnati Children's, or they could be things that have been received from other research partners or repositories like AdGene or Jackson Labs or UC Davis. So the MTA is a contracting mechanism that basically helps you protect those materials, or at least dictate the terms of how those materials can be used. We can stipulate things like ensuring that if somebody does a publication based upon a study with these materials, that they acknowledge that you were the inventor of these materials, or that you're the one that created them. We can ensure that those materials are not used for commercial purposes. We can ensure that they're not further transferred unless that person comes back and asks for you to do so. And then tack on fun situations with industry. When we're doing MTAs with industries, those are always a little bit more complicated. When we're shipping materials to industry as part of a research collaboration, generally those take the shape of more of a licensing agreement, and Justin's team or Geoffrey's team would likely take point on those versus my team and SRS. But also when we're bringing in materials from an industry partner where we have a research design in place, we have to pay pretty close attention to the IP terms, how the data is being accessed, who has access to it, who has ownership of it, publication rights, things along those lines. So when you're dealing with industry, it gets a little more complicated, but we can help you work through those particular instances. So at Children's specifically, all of the material transfer agreement requests are done through EPAS, and specifically EPAS agreements. And my team will take point on processing MTAs for you. Typically speaking, if we're bringing materials into the institution, the party that's sending those materials will also draft and send the contract. So when you create your MTA request within EPAS, be sure to upload that contract draft, and then we'll take point on negotiating that if necessary. If we're sending out materials, vice versa, we will generally draft up the contract for you, but we need to ensure that we know where the materials came from, or if they were created here at CCHMC. And if they were created here at CCHMC, then there should be an associated tech ID that goes along with those materials. And I provided the link here where those tech IDs can be done. And then Justin's team takes point on kind of reviewing those and assigning that tech ID that we can go in and access. When you do your EPAS entry, just make sure you note any special circumstances. Do you want to be acknowledged as part of the publication process? Do you have concerns about further transfers? Anything that would go above and beyond, or that you think we should be aware of when we're drafting up the contract templates? Justin, I think I turn it back over to you. Oh no, I turn it back over to Geoffrey to talk about UC's process.
Thanks, Dave. And our process asks very similar questions. The biggest difference really is right now we have an email-based system where you email this email right here and answer some very, very similar questions than what you would see at Children's EPAS system. Who's the PI? What is it? What's the name or description of the materials? You know, who are we going to contact about the agreement? So the other side. Who all needs to be kept in the loop? You know, is it just the postdoc or the grad student that is taking the lead on this, and they don't need the PI? And then with a little bit of distinction of where we're sending the materials or receiving the materials versus being sent, it just varies slightly on receiving the agreement, or to, much like Dave asked, for a note about any other restrictions you want to put on that. One of the questions ahead of time was whether there was an issue with foreign transfers. For the most part, no. I don't know about Children's processes, but UC, we do an export control screen to ensure that we're not sending the materials to a party that is somehow disbarred or debarred by the federal government. And we're not sending the materials in such a way that might violate the law. That's pretty seamless and handled in the background. If you're looking for information on shipping at UC, we would send you to the export control office because they have some experience helping faculty and researchers get through any of the permit processes and have that information on hand.
Geoffrey, there's a couple questions in the chat too, specific to UC.
And I'm about to answer them.
Oh, perfect. Great. Go ahead.
Thanks, Krista. No, so as we sort of cycle back out of research into the first early stages of the commercialization process and disclosure, assess, and protect, I'm going to turn this over to Justin. But one of the first questions we ask after, as part of our assessment, is ownership. And one of the questions in the chat, right, is if the research is performed completely outside campus by a UC employee using his or her own resources, what would be the recommended approach? So to answer that, the question comes back to what are the university's rules on IP ownership and invention ownership? Under the university's rules, we own anything done on campus using the university's resources and anything done anywhere within the scope of employment of a UC employee. Now, it's very easy to give you a black and white example that if you had a clinician who at home created a new plumbing tool, that would not, right? At home, they're doing something that's clearly outside the scope of their employment. That would not be owned by the university. But if they're doing something at home that is within their area of research or their area of expertise, then there's a strong possibility the university has rights in that, and we should talk. So our team is happy to have that conversation to understand what it is, how it relates to your research, how it relates to your role at the institution, and try to identify, whether this is something the university owns and therefore it needs to be retained by the or if it's something that we don't own and therefore it is in fact the creators. Justin, I assume you have very similar policies?
Yeah, very similar. Yeah, and I was going to jump in here. It's sort of like the why disclose piece, because I think that ties into it, right? There are some explanations here, but I think part of the why disclose is also, to Geoffrey's point, one of the assessments is who is the owner, right? So children's policy is a little bit different. It's going to be tied up in your employment agreement. I think the reality to keep in mind is that disclosure to us doesn't necessarily transfer ownership, right? Ownership is based on your employment agreement and the institutional policies. And so part of the reason to disclose, if you're concerned about that, is to disclose to us, and then we can have a conversation and think about, okay, given what your obligations are to us and the IP policy, who does own it? I think similar to Geoffrey, right? If someone who specializes in cancer research develops a new plumbing system, there's probably, we're not gonna take ownership in that. So I think that that's an important conversation to have, and I think you'd always be encouraged to reach out to us, to disclose to us, so that we can have that conversation and figure out, who owns it and things like that. And there are processes within the institution on how to get that over to you. I also see the second question around, the IP, what happens after the IP is licensed. Geoffrey, I'm wondering if maybe we get to that question when we talk about the licensing piece, because I feel like that'll be tied up later. So to that question, we'll bring that up later if that's okay.
Agreed.
Cool. So I think that there's this sort of why disclose to us. Again, I think that we're going to talk a little bit about intellectual property in a second, but the bottom line is, there's really kind of two reasons, right? One is because you want to scale the invention widely outside of the institution. And that might require intellectual property, that might require outside investment or external distributors, right? So working with us can help you get there. And the second really is if you want to share future revenue. So maybe you disclose a new idea and you want to make sure that if it gets sold, you want to share in the success of that, right? That's a reason to work with us so that we can protect the intellectual property. And again, anyone who falls under either Cincinnati Children's or UC's policies will be subject to a revenue share. So when the institution makes money, the inventors will also make money according to our IP policy. So two reasons I think to disclose there. I think the when to disclose, right? So the key is that if you can disclose to us prior to publication or presentation, honestly, if there's like maybe one or two things that you remember, this is probably one of the most important things. And the reason is because, if you publish, it makes it much harder to get intellectual property. And if it turns out that we needed it, it makes it much harder to commercialize. And I'll talk about the importance of IP in a second, but really, really key that you disclose to us before you publish or present so we can assess whether intellectual property is necessary and so that we can grab it there. So I think from the IP side, there's sort of a simple graphic. Let me actually go back. I saw a direct question to me. I think with regards to, there's a question here, and I'm happy to talk to you after the fact. But I think, for things that you're developing, in your home on your own, if it's clear you're not using any resources, if it's not tied to the institution, we're not going to come back. We're not going to sort of be upset about that. But I do think, it makes sense to talk to us if you have questions around whether something should or should not be disclosed. At least come ask us, come talk to us if you're feeling that it's gray, and that way we can give you that clarity. I think if it's just internal use for your family, we're not going to, worry about that. But I think it's always helpful to have the conversation with us to make sure you know where the clear lines are. I think coming back to intellectual property here on this slide, it's kind of a simple graphic and a very complicated citation. And the reason for that is because I'm a little bit oversimplifying here, but the main takeaway from IP is when there's a relatively high development cost and then a relatively low cost of copying, that's when you're going to want IP, because if there's a high development cost, you're going to need people to invest in that development. And if there's a low cost of copying, a relative low cost of copying, then that investor is not going to be incentivized to invest in it, because they're going to want to know that if they invest those dollars, they're not going to want someone to be able to copy it for free, essentially, or for cheaply. So I think that these are the relevant sort of thoughts to think about when IP is desirable. There's a lot more information in the citations, and I'm acknowledging that the citations here are pharma focused, but that's where a lot of the conversation on this topic comes in, and you can look at those to hear what the discussion looks like on to give you the ideas of when we're talking about high development costs and low cost of copy. That 2003 citation really talks about how patents have actually helped international adoption of certain drugs. And that 2016 article talks about how it's possible that intellectual property might not be necessary for flu vaccines because of the relative high cost of copy. Now, that was in 2016. That might be different now, but I think that that can give you a frame to how to think about it. But again, because there's the nuance there, it's just an encouragement to come talk to us so we can go through these steps and think through them. So again, we've talked a lot about disclosure here. So before you submit, here are the disclosure links. We'll be able to share these slides so that you'll be able to see where the disclosure links are. Obviously, there's one for Cincinnati Children's, one for UC. Our link is also on our Centerlink page, so you can get it that way. They're meant to be simple. So if it starts to feel complicated, ask us, right? We'll try to help you through it. It should not be a big burden to get the disclosure in. Once the disclosure comes in, right, we work with you, right? We'll sort of figure out, okay, is there a market opportunity here? Is it scalable? What is the technical feasibility? If IP is necessary, what is the strength of it? And then determine the next steps. And I think, the next steps, again, filing the IP if necessary before that publication comes out. I think, we'll talk a little bit about the resources that we have and the partnerships that we have. We do a lot of sort of work in building relationships with industry to try to find who the right partners are. I know Geoffrey does that work as well. Geoffrey, feel free to interject if you like. But I think going back to some of the questions that we had, these next steps are really going to be dependent on the asset, right? So if it's a behavioral tool, right, maybe we'll be thinking about, okay, is this some kind of a questionnaire that can be impactful in clinical studies, right? Maybe we want to license this to Mappy Trust, right, which sends out questionnaires available for clinical trials, or other resources that do translations of questionnaires to make sure that that questionnaire is accessible in as many languages as possible, right? If it's an educational tool, right, there's a question of, okay, what does the right distribution of this look like? Does this need to be turned into a game? Can we partner with a game manufacturer to distribute this? Does it make sense to turn that game into a digital asset, a digital game? And then can we find the partners to actually digitize that potential game? So I think that this is going to be very asset specific. And I think we welcome, really assets from across the spectrum to think about what these next steps could be. And then again, I think that these various commitments, right? This is very much a partnership. And I think it's really important that we both see it this way, right? So we can definitely look at market analysis. We can definitely assess and protect the IP. Our office does a lot of work trying to get input from outside entities and learning from that to identify what the next commercialization steps might be. And then we facilitate those conversations and negotiate agreements when they're relevant. But ultimately, this is a partnership, right? I think, when we're sharing that feedback with you, it might mean, you seeking out the funds from a grant perspective to do it. And that might mean applying for commercially relevant funds that we make you aware of, that you might not be aware of. It means that if we're filing intellectual property and have questions about a patent, we might need you to provide information and insight so we can get that patent issued, because it takes quite a while from the filing to the actual granting of it at the patent office. And really being available to talk to those commercial partners. And so, we talked a little bit about the sort of discovery aspect, the disclosure aspect, assessing and protecting from intellectual property. And then there's the marketing and license and startup perspective. And I want to maybe use this opportunity to come back to that question around, does the researcher lose any ability to continue the research and intervention? Geoffrey, I'm fairly confident this is going to be the same for you. Anytime that, and this is pretty standard in the industry, anytime an academic type transfer office, including Cincinnati Children's, and again, I'm fairly positive, including UC as well, whenever we license an invention out for commercial purposes, we always retain a internal research use license, and we also try to maintain the ability to license it out to other not-for-profit institutions for research purposes. So you should always be able to continue the research on your intellectual property here. Note that in a lot of these agreements, including when you're dealing with MTAs with industry, right, there might be a publication provision, which means that, let's say you get a material from industry or we license out an asset, maybe you can continue to do research on it, but before you publish, you might need to show that publication to that industry partner before you do publish to make sure that you're not revealing any of their confidential information or anything like that. So there is a little bit of that sort of reminder, hey, remember, if we're partnered with an industry, we need to make sure that they're reviewing those publications in line with whatever agreements we agree to. That's an important aspect. It's also worth noting that when we license inventions, right, industry is going to make their own improvements and developments on top of what we license to them. And there's always sort of a negotiation on what rights we might get on those improvements. And that can be a little bit more case specific depending on the innovation. And so when we're licensing a technology, this is one of the reasons why it's really important to be in close partnership with us, because as we're negotiating the agreement, we really need your input to make sure that we're not committing anything that's going to impact your research. And that's part of where the partnership comes from. Geoffrey, I don't know if you want to jump in with anything additional to that.
No, I mean, it's the same, right? I mean, our goal is to ensure that in our commercial interactions, that the underlying research is allowed to continue in whatever fashion it needs to be. We fully respect the academic freedom of our researchers to try to, as part of this whole process. And the expectation is that the researcher isn't simply going to stop their research because we've found a commercial partner. It's fully expected that will continue in some fashion and take its natural course.
Yeah, and I just want to pull on something also Geoffrey just said, which is that it's becoming more and more common, at least in our experience, license and asset, some additional industry-sponsored research back to the lab. So maybe there's ongoing research you want to do. Maybe there's also additional research that the company wants to see done, and they might sponsor some of that work when we license it. Or sometimes it starts off with a sponsored research agreement and then can turn into a license. And so that's another place where Dave's team will come in on Cincinnati Children's side, where maybe, you know, there's an industry partner that's interested in seeing work done. They might sponsor some of that research, and that agreement will go through Dave's office, but my office will be involved in the intellectual property terms of that to make sure it's ready, so that when it might turn into a license agreement, it's gonna flow seamlessly from that sponsored research agreement. You know, one of the things that came up in the video, right, is the time, right? And obviously this is going to be asset class specific. This is going to be asset specific, but it takes a while, right? I think that this is an important point to note, because I think that, you know, by the time that y'all are disclosing inventions to our offices, we know that y'all have been working on it probably for years at that point, right? And then so to sort of then learn that there's probably several more years of development before we can get it into industry can be, you know, it can be a little bit of a surprise, right? But I think that the reality is that when we get a disclosure, at least within our system, right, it takes about 5.5 years from first disclosure to actually get a license. So that's after maybe getting industry feedback. That's after we've gone down some part of the patent process, maybe. And maybe we've funded some of the internal work through some of our commercially relevant funds, and then only then is it ready for a license. And you know, as Geoffrey kind of alluded to, not everything turns into a license, but it's all about sort of working with us so that we can increase our chances for success. And just so to pull on that a little bit further, right? This is within Cincinnati Children's. We have these existing partnerships. So in addition to these partnerships, we also do marketing to whoever the relevant partners might be. But these are folks that we have particularly close relationships with, have received, you know, open innovation research funding proposals from, or have actual agreements with to do that. You know, we have a medical device collaborations, lots of collaborations with pharmaceutical companies. But in addition to that, right, we also have a collaboration with the state of Ohio around the Technology Validation and Startup Fund. And that's going to be focused more on technologies that have more of a near-term exit. So maybe stuff on the digital health side or on the consumer side, or maybe even medical devices. And we also have venture partnerships as well. And that's really important from a feedback perspective, because these close partnerships allow us to share early stage inventions with them and get that feedback quickly. I'm seeing this question here. Do we have a licensing timeline for internally venture lab founded startups? Geoffrey, I think that's a question for you since it's a venture lab question. I think just quickly on the Cincinnati Children's side, you know, when we fund a technology through the Innovation Fund, the timeline to startup is going to be asset specific from our side, but I know that there's a much more specific program on the venture lab side. So Geoffrey, if you want to jump in there.
Yeah, I mean, again, the timeline really depends in so many ways on the outside parties, right? So getting a technology from inside UC to outside the institution really just, it depends on a variety of different factors, such as finding the right partner at the right time in the right place. And we'll talk about a little bit about the Venture Lab and its resources, and they're available to anyone in the UC community. That's Cincinnati Children's, that's UC, and it doesn't. We are not ownership agnostic. So, and we've had faculty from Children's who have a website and doing medical education externally, run through the Venture Lab and go through Venture Lab. We also had faculty who I believe, and Justin will correct me if I'm wrong, got their technology from Children's, the Datrium. It's one of the lists. I don't know if it was a release or if it was a license. I'm not actually sure which, but they've gone through the Venture Lab now. They've received funding from the Venture Lab as well as funding from the Third Frontier of the state of Ohio. But in terms of the Venture Labs process, there are specific timelines associated with the different steps of that, including the pre-accelerator. And Justin, do you mind just jumping ahead like 2 slides? Two slides real fast. Back one. So it's a 7-week process where you go through, and we're veering close to graduation. Graduation, I believe, is next week, if not the week after, to help turn early ideas into big ideas first. And so you learn things, and these are terms you may or may not have heard, but you learn things like customer discovery. What does the end user really like or want? What are their actual problem? Not the problem that you think it is, but the actual problem across a wide breadth. You learn the business plan, business canvas plan, where to try to take all those different problems and narrow it into to understand what really is that minimally viable product, right? What is the product that you need to go after and make first so that you can get out there? It teaches some of the other basic of value proposition, how to share what the value of your idea is to an audience that maybe doesn't understand the technology space that you're in. At graduation, the idea is for you to start forming your team, to find that entrepreneur who's ready to help you take it to the next step, or to find the talent that perhaps your team is currently missing. Now, for UC teams, and we in specific cases clearly consider children's UC teams, they can come back and access some of our funds, which will allow them to take and further develop. Now, keep in mind, develop that idea within the university, with the idea at the end of about a year. That projects usually are no longer than a year. The funds are milestoned along the way to launch a new company based on that concept. So to Prashant's question about timing, it depends oftentimes when you've found and able to form that full team, and then you're able to access the license. I mean, I've watched startups form early, and then they essentially are sitting on an option to IP, trying to find either their entrepreneur or trying to find a venture capital partner or a funder partner who will help take them to the next step for a year or two before where you want to call them a true fully functioning company. It just depends. It depends on the technology, depends on the space, depends on what their development plan is.
Yeah, thanks, Geoffrey. Yeah, I think that the idea that it is kind of asset specific is important. I will say that, again, to Geoffrey's point, the Venture Lab is available to Cincinnati Children's investigators. It's a very good, thorough program in thinking about how to think about a startup. We have had faculty go through that program. I think, we've had situations where we've licensed the technology to a startup that came out of that. I think also, though, one of the distinctions maybe between Cincinnati Children's and UC is how we think about startups. I think the majority of our startups are much more in partnership with an existing investor, with an experienced management team. And so, that's generally where our institution leans. But again, happy to have that conversation with any investigator. So I want to quickly go back to a case study from our side, right? Just to give you a sense both of the collaboration between Cincinnati Children's and UC, and also like the timeline on how things could work, right? So there was an NIH-funded collaboration between Cincinnati Children's Division of Sports Medicine and psychologists at UC, which resulted in this virtual coach to assess, correct, and optimize the user's biomechanics objectively and autonomously. It was like an augmented reality platform with sensors that could sort of spot individual movements and then give the user feedback on their movements to make sure that they were biomechanically appropriate, right? Really potential huge for physical therapy markets and sports markets, things like that. Again, they had been working on it for a while, but they disclosed it to us in 2014. There was more data that was acquired, and we filed a patent in 2016. Our internal gap funding program, the Innovation Fund, in partnership with the State of Ohio's Technology Validation Startup Fund, funded additional commercial development internal to the institutions in 2018. And then Finally, in 2019, we licensed it to include health, which was actually a locally based startup funded by a UC DAP graduate, and then funded by Cincy Tech, which is a local seed investor. And since then, the company has done really well advancing that technology, and the product is now in the market. And I have their website here. But again, it sort of gives you a sense of the time that it takes, right? And sort of the steps that it takes. Rarely when we get a disclosure of something ready, it requires that additional funding, that additional development to get it out. And even then, right, it might go to a young company that still has to sort of do additional development once it's there. Again, because of the different ways that Cincinnati Children's and UC does startups, a lot of these startups were founded in conjunction with investors, with a management team, but this is just an example of some of the successful startups that we can share here. Geoffrey, I know this is back to you. Do you anything else on this slide before I move forward? No. I don't know if you want to jump in here on this one. You're on mute, Geoffrey.
Much like Justin, UC has a number of our own startups. I think the biggest difference between oftentimes between UC and Children's is we are more than just the College of Medicine, right? So we cover, and you can see it here. Ample started in the College of Engineering. Dr. Lynn is now College of Medicine. Peel 9 is out of our College of Education and Criminal Justice. Synthesis is out of Chemistry and Arts and Sciences. Band Connect is out of DAP. Datrium is out of Children's. Clean Earth Rovers is a partnership. The original founders are from Xavier and UC. Smart Health is from is being led by one of part of our provost office, and Neural Payments is alums. So these are the teams that have gone through the Venture Lab. Some of them are UC owned and have UC IP that they've been developing. Others brought their own IP, learned from the Venture Lab, received funding to try to take those developments forward.
Yeah, I just want to jump in also. I know that a lot of these previous slides have been around startups. Obviously, that's something that both of us do. And right, we also license to existing entities too, right? I mean, you saw in our sort of collaboration slide, partnerships with Takeda and Sanofi and Pfizer, right? So these ideas that depending on the asset, a license to an existing company could make sense, or a startup could make sense. And again, we can work with you to figure out what makes the most sense there. Yeah, then Geoffrey, if you want to close us out.
So you have our contact information here. Are there any questions for any of us? Seeing as there aren't. At what point do you typically recommend getting an option? So first, let's define an option so everybody knows what that is. So an option is, in its simplest form, a first right to negotiate. Now, some of those terms behind the option can already be negotiated, but it's a first right. So it means that if you have an option to a technology, an option to a piece of intellectual property, an option to the output of research, which is where we often see that in sponsored research, in an industry-sponsored agreement, it means that the university or Children's won't negotiate with anyone else during some time period. An option could last a year, it could last 90 days. It just depends on the circumstances and what's been negotiated. From the university, I mean, it is really a case dependent. If you have concerns that someone else will be interested in the technology while you are out there trying, working on it, and you're set on starting a company, I would recommend talking about that as soon as possible. If you're in the process of talking, starting to get into diligence or conversations with a venture capital firms, right? Somebody with funding, you're going to want to have that option because they're going to ask, so what rights do you have in the technology? So to the earlier point of, is it patent filing or is it incorporation? It really depends. We talked about the circle. One of the challenges of the circle is that really marketing and protection takes place at the same time, right? our teams, both on both sides of the street, are at the same time that the technology is being marketed, we're also working on the intellectual property filings. So it really is in that sort of those two steps are really together, all three of them into licensing. All three sort of happen in a parallel mishmash of all going on, going on at the same time.
Yeah, thanks. And just to jump in on the option thing again, I think, you know, we obviously do grant these options both to existing entities when they're sponsoring research, just like Geoffrey mentioned, and Dave, you can jump in because a lot of that happens through your office because sponsored research go through there. You know, generally when we're optioning technologies to essentially a new company, again, I think as a rule in general, we're optioning it to the seed investor who's going to be developing a company. So we're actually negotiating an option right now with, you know, a seed investor who plans to do some assessments over the course of the year to determine if they want to license technology. And that's generally how we're going to do it at Children's. Dave, I don't know if you wanted to jump in on the option side, the sponsor research side.
No, I think you summed it up perfectly.
So I'm seeing this question. Could you please comment on who does the negotiation with a company interested in licensing IP? How is this process? So from a children's perspective, our office is responsible for that negotiation. That goes through our office. And again, I think that this has to be in partnership with the PI. Ultimately, a license is not going to be successful with a company if the PI is not on board, because it's not as simple as here's the patent, go commercialize it, right? There's a lot of knowledge that you know that needs to be transferred along with that license. So if you're not on board with who the partner is and how that agreement goes, right, it's not going to go well. And so I think that, you know, we need to be in partnership, I think, on that negotiation, but ultimately that negotiation is led by our side. All the financial provisions, all of that stuff, you know, goes through our office in partnership with you, making sure you're aware of what's going on. And honestly, different faculty want to be involved in different ways in the licensing process. So we try to accommodate that as best we can. Geoffrey?
It's the same. So we take the lead. We are routinely, you know, seeking input from the faculty member. In some cases, particular things like research tools to understand what the value really is, what could the cost to reproduce this material from following the publication that's out there. But in terms of royalties and structure, we're trying to make sure we understand what the value is and make sure that value reflects what everyone's interested in seeing happen. Because at the end of the day, I mean, to Justin's point, just simply giving someone rights to something in a patent, it rarely puts anybody in a position for success. You know, there are some cases where they can either have a different expert on the same space and that they can quickly pick up on what's happening, but in a lot of cases, the PI, the original lead inventor, or their graduate student are key to that full-blown commercialization process that'll go on inside, whether it's a startup or an existing company.
Yeah, and I totally agree with all of that. And I also, you know, want to just talk about a little bit how in some ways there is some trust that needs to be built between like our office and the PI as we're going through that negotiation. Again, we need to be in partnership, and that requires a sort of a level of trust on what norms might be. You know, just to be transparent, right? I've seen, you know, things that maybe go askew when there's misunderstood expectations on both sides, maybe between the company and the faculty member, right? So leveraging our experience so everyone knows what the norms are will actually help get the deal across the finish line, so that everyone sort of goes into it and comes out of it feeling like they're getting what is appropriate and standard and normal. I don't see any more questions, and I know that we're coming up here in the last couple of minutes. Dr. Zeller, I thought maybe I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you. No, I think what a very comprehensive and interesting presentation. All of you, thank you. These, like all K clubs, are available online. There'll be a gap of time before they're up, but in the CTR online function, and that link is at the bottom of the flyer. Thank you everyone for attending, and to our presenters.